This is a wonderful session that is going to introduce you to a resource guide that I have found already invaluable. It's a resource guide for all of us who are mental health professionals and who are working with youth who either are involved in juvenile justice, have been involved in juvenile justice, or at risk for being involved in juvenile justice. We need to know about the juvenile justice system and how to work with it and within it. So today, by the way, I'm Julian Ford. I'm the co-director of the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And there you see uh, our website. Please do take a look at that in the future for all the resources that we have, which are many for doing trauma-informed work with and in the juvenile justice system and with youth involved in juvenile justice. But today, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Carly Bates, who is a clinical psychologist and an attorney. She's got dual talent, and she is also a clinical assistant professor at the New York University School of Medicine and associate professor in psychology at Purdue University Northwest. And Dr. Bates has led the development of this resource guide. She is one of the most absolutely knowledgeable experts about working on the intersection of mental health and juvenile justice. And I know you're going to enjoy hearing Dr. Bates as well as learning about the resource guide. So take it away, Carly.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Just a few housekeeping and reminders. We are recording. And then at the end, I will show an option for you to download a certificate of attendance. And any questions you all have, feel free to put them in the chat and we will hopefully have some time at the end. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to finally see this resource come to fruition. It has been in the works for a number of years. As you know, Dr. Ford explained, I'm a clinical psychologist. I have many years of experience working with kids and families in juvenile justice settings. And I was also a public defender for kids in juvenile justice cases. And I could talk for hours about the intricacies of the juvenile justice system. So it's really an honor to be able to introduce this guide to you all today. And I hope that this is an invaluable resource, as Dr. Ford said. So before we start talking about the resource and really give you a sneak peek into the content, it's hot off the presses. I really just wanted to take a moment to talk about why we created this resource in the first place. So starting with a quote from a youth in detention. In the years that I've worked in juvenile justice settings, I've heard many terms used to describe the kids that are in those settings or involved in the juvenile justice system, often even from well-meaning people in their lives. So terms like bad, defiant, aggressive, broken, damaged. And after more than a decade working with this population of kids, as both a lawyer and a clinician, I'm really still waiting to meet a youth who truly fits those descriptions. What I've found instead are kids who made unfortunate choices, but are doing their best to survive in the face of extraordinary obstacles, extensive trauma histories, and a lot of negative messages about who they are and who they can become. Most of them, if not all of them, have a host of strengths that have never been discovered or not tapped into. But as a clinician, this can be a really challenging population to work with, not only because youth's presentations are often very complex, but also because of all the challenges that are inherent in the systems that they interact with, including the juvenile justice system. But for so many reasons, it's so essential that youth involved in juvenile justice in the juvenile justice system receive high quality mental health care. And our hope is really that this guide will provide additional support for anyone who may want to work with this population or already does this work. So to that end, I just want to take a step back and sort of highlight a youth. This obviously name has been changed, but this presentation is very similar to a youth that I worked with. So let's imagine for a moment that you're asked to begin working with a youth with juvenile justice involvement. So this is Jonah, and here's what we might know about him initially. His mom has come to you. She's desperately seeking services for him. He's a Black youth. He's 15 years old. He resides with mom and his two younger siblings. He's been arrested at the point that mom comes to see you. He's been arrested for assault. He's been arrested for possession of a weapon. Those are the charges that he's facing right now. He also has a history of 3 prior arrests for similar charges. And mom suspects he's using marijuana pretty frequently and that this started around age 11. He's also failing most of his classes. He hasn't been attending school, at least not consistently for the last year or so. He's been fighting a lot in the community and also in school. And his current charge is actually stems from an event in school where he was in a fight with another peer. And the police searched him and found a knife in his possession. Mom thinks there might be gang involvement. She's not 100% sure, but she suspects that he's hanging out with kids who are older than him, and she thinks this might be gang related. The family does have a history of child welfare involvement, although at this point, we don't know exactly what that was. And as I mentioned, mom is seeking mental health services. So I want you to just think about your initial perceptions of Jonah. Think about some of the words that come to mind to describe him. And we're going to take a moment posing this question. I think we have a poll for you guys to fill out. Just wanted to get your feedback, right? Honestly, would you be willing to work with him? So how open would you be to working with Jonah, given the information that we know right now as a mental health provider? And even if you are interested in working with him or think you might want to, what concerns might you have about doing work with him as a provider, as a therapist? I'll give you all just a moment to complete that. Okay, Riley, I don't know. I'm not seeing any results. I'm not sure if closed yet. Okay, here we go. So it looks like a large majority of you would be willing to work with him, which is great. Some people said maybe, and a small percentage said no. So I'm sure there were a number of concerns. It sounds like about 66% of you answered with some concerns. I can't see those concerns, but I'm sure they might have been things like, or I suspect they may be things like um, not really knowing a lot about the system that Jonah's involved in, maybe being worried about being subpoenaed, right, or asked to come to court, maybe just not feeling equipped to be able to work with some of maybe the behaviors that he's exhibiting or expressing in his involvement with the system. Those are all things that are really understandable, right, and normal reactions to thinking about working with the kids in the system. Oh, okay, I'm getting the results. Let's see. Nope, I can't see them. That's okay. Um, uh, so I wanted to just get a sense from you all and have you start thinking about, right, some of those concerns. And our hope is that with this guide, some of the concerns that you all have about working with this population might be able to be addressed with some of the information and resources that we're going to be providing. So when we think about Jonah, right, what we really had initially was just information about his arrest, right? Some of his negative, challenging behaviors, things that maybe brought him to the attention of the juvenile justice system. But when we start working with him, right, if we choose to work with him as a clinician, we then learn a lot more about what he's experienced in his life, right? So in this case, Jonah's been through a lot in his short life. He's been through and experienced and continues to experience a lot of community violence. He was assaulted on his way to school at ages 11 and 13. He was the victim of a drive-by shooting at age 11. He was also a complaining witness in a shooting, right? So we know also that a lot of times kids who are in the juvenile justice system, maybe as defendants or respondents, have also been involved in the system, maybe as victims or survivors of trauma. He's also experienced traumatic loss. He's lost 2 close friends to gun violence this year, right? So a lot of community violence exposure. And we knew that he had some child welfare involvement, but now it becomes a little bit more clear maybe what that was. So it sounds like he witnessed his dad harm his mom at an early age, between the ages of 2 and 5. And his father was actually father was incarcerated as a result of this. And there was a child protective case that was filed as well. He also has a history of sexual abuse. So it came to light that he was sexually abused by his maternal uncle, and his mom discovered the abuse. She was very supportive, and his uncle is now incarcerated. So Jonah has been through a lot in his short life, right? And we can see that there are various ages at which he experienced a significant amount of trauma. And I want you to think about whether this changes your view of Jonah from that initial reaction or response, right? Those initial words that I asked you to think about. And if so, right, does this change kind of your perception of the work that you might do with him as a clinician? So unfortunately, this presentation that I just showed you about Jonah is really not uncommon, right? Jonah is the rule rather than the exception. So this is a quote from a clinician who works and has worked for a long time with kids in the system, right? In almost 10 years of providing services, she has yet to meet a kid that hasn't experienced extensive trauma. And things like shootings, stabbings, right? Community violence, things that no child should ever have to go through. And way back when I was practicing law, this was in the early 2000s, I'm dating myself, no one was talking about trauma in the juvenile justice system. Now we know so much more about it, right? So we even know now from so much research that there's such a high percentage of kids in the system. It's, again, as I mentioned, it's almost the rule, right? Rather than the exception. 80 to 90%, or even more than 90% in some studies, of kids have experienced at least one traumatic event. And a large number, much larger percentage as compared to community samples actually go on to develop PTSD. And we also know that involvement in the juvenile justice system can exacerbate untreated traumatic stress. There are trauma triggers everywhere in the juvenile justice system. So as providers, we can't necessarily change those triggers, right? We can't modify them or make them not happen, but we are in a position to help youth manage and cope with some of those things that they're experiencing in the system. So we are not magicians, right? The therapeutic process takes time, and the challenges that kids are facing are not always about mental health. But as mental health providers, we are in a unique position to really support healing and rehabilitation for kids in the system or at risk of involvement with the system. But in order to do that, we need to know much more about the complex system that youth and their families are encountering. So much jargon, right? So many confusing structures. And every jurisdiction, even to make it more confusing, every jurisdiction does things a little bit differently. But there are some common elements across systems. And so with this guide, we really did our best to capture those in a comprehensive way, so that when you're working with a youth, or you're thinking about working with a youth who's involved in some way or has contact with the system, you have a lot more knowledge to be able to apply both to the work you're doing with the youth, but also in the ways that you might be able to interact with the people that that youth is interacting with in the system. So let's dive in. I'm going to introduce you to this resource guide, give you a sense of what we have in store for you in here. As I mentioned, this is designed specifically for mental health providers who are really seeking to understand or better understand the juvenile justice system. So we're going to be providing in this guide a lot of knowledge, a lot of resources, and also we're going to give you a lot of initiatives that are going on in the system that you might not be aware of. So this resource guide includes 8 modules, an introduction and 8 modules, and then we have 4 appendices to give you even more resources in case what we have in modules 1 through 8 are not enough. So you'll see that we cover a variety of topics here. 1 and 2 are really giving you a very, very comprehensive overview of the history of the system, what it looks like now, and then how kids navigate through that system, what that process looks like for when youth are involved in the system. We also focus very specifically in a module on tips for you, for mental health professionals. And then we'll also give you some guidance on screening and assessment measures, some that are used in the system that mental health providers may or may not be familiar with, because they're a little bit different sometimes from what we do in outpatient, let's say, or inpatient clinical work. We'll also talk a little bit about interventions, give you a lot of detail about that, alternatives to arrest and incarceration. So not every kid who is arrested ends up going through the system formally. So there are a lot of ways that kids can be diverted away from the system, or even once they're formally prosecuted, they could still be diverted in some cases, so that they're not spending time incarcerated or detained. We also wanted to provide some overarching considerations, things to think about that really intersect with all of these other different modules. And then there is a module on schools and the juvenile justice system, because there is a significant intersection between schools and youth ending up in the juvenile justice system. So we have provided some information about that. And then lots of recommended reading and resources and tools and initiatives. So our guide, kind of in a nutshell, offers practical knowledge and trauma-informed guidance for mental health providers. It really tries to highlight the intersection between mental health and juvenile justice involvement. And then we provide a lot of initiatives and resources that are specific to the legal system. So our goals here are really all about the provider, right? Empowering providers with knowledge and skills to help them better support the youth that they might be working with or thinking about working with. We really want to try to change the narrative about youth who are in the system or at risk of being involved in the system. One of our goals is also to increase openness. So if you're a provider who has always thought you might want to work with this population, but you're not so sure, or you feel like you need a lot more support and information, this is the guide for you. So we're hoping to increase openness to working with this population and thereby encouraging providers or more providers to be able to provide high quality mental health services to this population. We also are hoping through some of the resources that we provide that providers who are working with youth in these settings might consider how the factors that their kids are facing in the juvenile justice system can be integrated into treatment. So when you're working with a youth who's interacting with the system at the same time, there are a whole host of things that youth may be experiencing within the system, depending upon what stage or what part of the continuum they're in, that are really important for treatment. So it's important for providers to know about those. So now we're going to give you a sneak peek into each module, and we're going to actually use Jonah. We're going to come back to Jonah and sort of use him and his experience to highlight some of the things that you'll find in each module and some of the ways that the content can be most helpful. So this is literally the first time we are sharing anything about this resource with the world. So I'm very excited for you all to hear about this. So let's say you've decided to take Jonah's case. You're now his therapist, okay? So we know he's been arrested, but we now know that he's being prosecuted. So he's facing delinquency charges in a juvenile court. So he's been through a lot in his short life, but now he's going to be grappling with a lot of issues that are related to his involvement in the juvenile justice system, right? He might be struggling with guilt and shame and regret over what happened that led him to be arrested. But the system itself might also be presenting some triggers for him, and he might be having strong emotional and behavioral reactions to some of what he's encountering as a respondent or defendant in a juvenile delinquency case. So you are a highly competent clinician, right? You are really good at your job. You know what you are doing. But the only thing you really know about the justice system is what you've seen on TV, right? Which is true for a lot of people. So you don't know much about the juvenile justice process. It is so complex, right? So just to kind of give you a sense, this is just, we recreated this image from a variety of different images that we found from different resources to make it clear. But even I, who have practiced in this system, when I look at this image, right, it's still overwhelming. Think about what a youth or a family, right, what they're facing when they're entering a system like this. So we want you to know everything about all of these different stages of the process. So the goal of these two modules, right, 1 and 2, to the rescue, right? These modules will help provide you with everything you need to better understand the system. So I mentioned, every jurisdiction is different, but we did our best to really give you this comprehensive overview of the general components. And the modules also, these two modules give you a sense of what we know, right, from the research about youth who are more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system, right? So we know that male adolescents, Black and brown youth, and youth around the age of 15, right, are most likely to end up in the system. So let's say that you start working with Jonah, but he's starting to talk about things in your sessions that are happening in his court case. But he doesn't seem to know much about his court case, and he's having trouble figuring out even what stage of the process it's in. And you have limited information about what's taking place, right? Naturally, because you're not in that system. And you start to think that speaking with someone in the court system really might be helpful, but you're not sure how to do this. Who would you even reach out to? What you would communicate, right? The goals of the therapist and the goals of those working with youth in the juvenile justice system might be different, right? They might not be exactly aligned. And Jonah's mom also shares she was contacted by yet another clinician about services for Jonah through the court, but she's not sure exactly who or why. And you're really concerned, right? Because it's not clinically indicated for him to be seeing two different therapists at the same time. But again, you're not sure who to contact or even where Jonah is in the process. So Module 3 can help. In Module 3, we provide a lot of really important tips and trauma-informed guidance for both working with youth and families themselves who are navigating the system, but also tips and guidance for interacting with and reaching out to and communicating with people who are working within the system, mental health providers within juvenile justice, but that also might be things like probation officers, right, or attorneys. So Module 3 is the place to go. So Jonah tells you in one of his recent sessions that he just had an intake screening with a probation officer, and he thinks some of the questions came from something called the Daisy or the Hazy. Maybe it was the Maisie. And does this mean he's on probation, right? He just had an intake screening with a probation officer. Does this mean that Jonah himself is now on probation? Not exactly clear, right? And then mom tells you after that session that the judge said something about ordering some kind of intensive family therapy. She doesn't quite remember the name of the intervention. The judge said it really quickly, didn't really ask mom if that was something that she'd be open to, right? Or whether that would even be the right thing for the family. And nobody told her anything about what it entails, right? What would she be doing? How would it work? Would it be in the house, in outpatient? Very limited information. This is quite common. Maybe it's MST, right? So in Module 4 is all about screening and assessment, but Module 5 provides a lot of information about intervention. So in Module 4, we discuss and we describe in some detail the role of screenings and assessments in juvenile justice settings. So for diagnostic purposes, in many settings, in juvenile justice settings, some of the same tools that you're already familiar with might be used. But there are also a variety of different screeners, brief assessment measures, and risk assessment measures that may also be used and may also be used with the kids that you're working with, that are very different from what we often typically use with our clinical work outside of the juvenile justice system. So Module 4 guides you through the purpose of screening in the system and the purpose of assessment, gives you some information about the difference between, let's say, a mental health screening and a risk assessment screening. They are very different and have very different purposes. And then in Appendix 3, you're going to get a list of the most commonly used screening and assessment measures in the system. So we'll provide you with the details about how it works, and then also you can reference some of the screeners. So if Jonah comes to you and says, yeah, it sounded like the Hazy or the Daisy, right? Okay, I think he's talking about the Maisie too. In Module 5, we're going to give you a huge list, many pages of mental health interventions that are more commonly used in juvenile justice settings. So you, again, just like screening and assessment, you'll see some in there that are going to be similar to ones that you already know. But there are a lot of interventions in there that are going to be a little bit different from the ones that would typically be used in clinical work. And so our goal with this module was not to give you a comprehensive list of all the possible clinical interventions, but more so focusing on the ones that clinicians who don't work in juvenile justice settings or with youth in the juvenile justice system might not be familiar with. So some of them might be familiar to you, but others may not. So in that module, we provide you with the intervention name itself, a link, sometimes a link to the manual for that intervention, a description of it, its purpose, components, and then we give you some information about the number of sessions. And then where we could, we have information about, where to contact or who to contact or what websites to go to so that you can find more. So that if you're working with a kid who is working with you for therapy and they're letting you know that they're also doing something with this other therapist through the court system, you have a better understanding of what exactly they're involved in and maybe then who to reach out to get some more information. So you're finally able to reach Jonah's attorney after many, many phone calls, which I unfortunately can be the case. I was in that role, and I can tell you that attorneys, especially public defenders, many of them are amazing lawyers. They get a very bad rap, but they have very high caseloads, just like many mental health providers. So they are often unable to call you back, which is very frustrating for a provider, especially when a kid is expressing things to you in a session that you're very unclear about, right? And you want to get a better sense from the attorney, which is always helpful, obviously, with permission and HIPAA and all of those things. It can be really essential to understand from the child's attorney where they are in the process so that you can better understand what the child is bringing to session when they talk about some of the challenges they're facing. So let's say after many phone calls, you're finally able to reach Jonah's attorney, and he tells you that he is really fighting and trying hard to get a restorative justice program in place. So he'd like to avoid a disposition or a sentence of residential placement for Jonah. But since he's been arrested in the past a few times for similar charges, the judge is really concerned about releasing him. Well, he's in the community right now, but the judge is really concerned about letting him remain in the community without being in some sort of service or program to try to help him not be rearrested again. So the prosecutor is pushing for residential placement, and the attorney is fighting for a more alternative to incarceration program. So he mentions a restorative justice program. He also mentions diversion. He talks about diversion a couple of times, but it's really unclear what he means by that, whether that's an option, what it even is. So mom is on board with, as you can imagine, anything that keeps her child home. She's really supportive of Jonah. She's concerned, but supportive. And so she's on board. But in your therapy session, when Jonah talks about this, because he tells you that he heard that his attorney said something about some restorative justice program. He doesn't know what that is, but he thinks he knows a little bit about it. The attorney gave him like a quick snapshot idea of it. And in your session, he expresses concern over just generally the uncertainty in his court case. But he's also really nervous because it sounds like in this restorative justice program, he might be face to face with the victim in his case during that session. And he has a lot of conflicting feelings about this. He wants to do, whatever is possible to be able to remain in the community. And he's feeling a lot of regret and shame and guilt about what happened. And so he, in some ways, likes the idea of being able to talk to the victim and explain and apologize. But on the other hand, he's really nervous about doing that. So he's really conflicted. And you're not quite sure what a restorative justice program is, right? Also, restorative justice programs can look different in different places. So And diversion, right, was also mentioned by the attorney. And that's also a really complicated term because diversion can mean so many things. It can come at various stages of the process. So kids can be diverted after they're arrested. They can be diverted even after they've already had formal charges filed against them in court. There are many places where a kid could be diverted, and there are many different kinds of programs and services that a youth might be diverted to. So it's really helpful for you to have a little bit more information about what these things mean so that you can work with Jonah. Now, obviously, right, in this situation, you're not necessarily going to be giving Jonah a lot of psychoed about all these things. You might if you feel comfortable doing that, but you don't necessarily have to, right? It should be the lawyer and others in the system who are giving him that information. But if you're armed with information about what that process looks like, you can at least have a conversation with him, right? And explore some of that conflict with a better understanding of what it is that he might be facing. We know also, and we talk a lot about this in the guide as well, we try to provide as much research as we can for you. We know that diversion and alternative to incarceration programs are much more effective at reducing recidivism or, reoffending and improving other outcomes for kids as compared to being formally processed in a court, right? So, meaning having a prosecutor file charges and a youth going in front of a judge and then ultimately being sentenced to something more formal like incarceration. We know that when kids are diverted away from the system, especially when that happens early on in a case, so much more effective at preventing that youth from coming back to the system. So in module 6, there's a lot of, we have some research in there for you. We have some definitions and resources for you to learn more. So I've shown you a little snapshot here of our resources section. And we have a resources section in every module where we provide some additional videos. We have a lot of videos that we link you to and documents so that you can learn more about this topic. And so hopefully you can feel more confident and competent when addressing the concerns that Jonah is bringing to you about this possible restorative justice program. So overarching considerations, this module has a lot of information in it related to some of the things that we hope that providers will be thinking about that are really overarching all of the different kids and things that kids are facing in the system. So we know that youth with justice involvement are often facing significant economic challenges, social challenges, and many other challenges that can be really difficult for them to navigate and also really difficult for clinicians to navigate, right? Many of the youth that are in settings, juvenile justice settings, or even those at risk of involvement in the juvenile justice system may also be multi-system involved. So they may be kids who are also involved in some way with the child welfare system. And so those youth would be called multi-system involved youth, or crossover youth is a term that's often used. And there's so many concerns, right, just related to a youth being in one system, but then when kids are involved in both systems, right, this just really heightens their vulnerability in so many ways. And caregivers themselves are often struggling. I think that this is one area where I think we need a lot more work in juvenile justice settings and just as providers. Caregivers of kids who are in the juvenile justice system or even at risk of involvement, I think often get stigmatized and blamed for their youth involvement, but they also have limited support, limited resources, and the juvenile justice system itself, I can say from my own experience, is not always great about pulling caregivers in to try to help solve the problems. They're often left out of treatment decisions and not intentionally necessarily. There's often just so many barriers in the system itself to even doing family therapy, which we know in many cases works really well, right? And is evidence-based. So caregivers themselves are facing a lot of different struggles in their own lives, right? I mentioned the high rates and high prevalence of trauma among youth in the juvenile justice system, but we also need to be thinking about what caregivers have been through in their lives as well, right? Thinking about intergenerational trauma, historical trauma. So caregivers are definitely struggling, right? And so in our overarching considerations piece module, we do have a section devoted to caregivers. We're hoping to actually expand upon that section in the future, maybe even make it its own module, because I think this is a topic that really deserves more attention. And oftentimes, caregivers want to be more involved, but they don't know how to be. And providers want caregivers to be more involved, but they don't know how to involve them. And so nobody's making that happen, right? And it can be so challenging. So we know, going back to Jonah, bringing it back to that context, that Jonah's family is facing a lot of these challenges, right? So his family, we didn't really talk about this in kind of that intro to him, but his family is living in poverty. We know from just what Jonah's experienced in his life that his family is residing in a neighborhood that has a lot of community violence. Mom is often scared to let Jonah go outside, and she really wants her son home, but she did share at one point he did have to spend one night in detention, so he was arrested. The police brought him to detention, and then the next day he went in front of a judge for his first appearance, and the judge allowed him to go home. And mom did share that although she absolutely wants him home, for that night that he was in detention, it was the first night that she could relax, at least knowing that nothing was going to happen to him, right? Because when he's out in the community every day, she's terrified that something's going to happen to him. And his family also, as I mentioned, has prior involvement with the child welfare system, right? So this is a youth who isn't concurrently involved in two systems, right? But he was involved with child welfare in the past. And it might be important to get a little bit more information from him and even the family about what that experience was, what it was like, and how that might be impacting him now, right? We do know also that kids who are who are crossover youth, who have had dual involvement with both systems, and then other factors as well, like poverty, right? All of these things can also be related to a youth's entry into the system, right? They increase the risk of juvenile youth offending and involvement in the juvenile justice system. So module 7, I think, unlike some of the other modules which are providing, specific knowledge in terms of, here's how you navigate the system, here's the definition of this. I think module 7 is really meant to be provide information to really get providers thinking about all of these things and just really considering them, right, as you're working with kids who are interfacing with this system. So module 7 really tries to highlight a lot of these overlapping personal, social, and political realities that are impacting the youth that you may be working with and their families. And I think another thing that's important, and we definitely have this as a disclaimer at the top of this module, is that we definitely don't cover all of them. There are so many other things that kids are facing when they're in the system and just, in their lives, and their families are facing. And so it really is just intended to give you sort of a brief snapshot of all of those different considerations, but certainly isn't comprehensive. And we definitely, unintentionally maybe didn't include many of them. So one thing also that I'll mention about this guide is that we really want this to be a living document. So I'll speak in a moment toward the end about how you access it and the formats for it, but we also would love your feedback about the content in this resource guide. So if there are things that you notice and you feel like, wow, that's missing, I really think that's an important part and would really make it a lot easier for me to work with this population. I wish this was included. Let us know, and we'll let you know how to do that because we want to make this living. We want this to be useful and practical for you. And so we're excited to hear from you all after people end up using this resource and reading it through and letting us know what more you want to see. So one of Jonah's arrests was after a fight in school, if you remember back to one of my earlier slides. And so I think I mentioned that He was arrested after a fight in school, and then when the police arrested him and did a pat down, they found a knife in his possession. So then he was charged additionally with possession of a weapon. And you're also really concerned, right? I talked about his attendance. He's been inconsistently attending school, definitely over the last year. I didn't mention this, but it's likely that if he's inconsistently attending, his grades have dropped pretty significantly. And as his therapist, you're understandably concerned about that his lack of connection to school, right? And you're starting to worry that he's 15, but you're starting to worry that he's really fallen behind and isn't going to be able to get enough credits to be able to graduate from high school, which actually he has shared a number of times as one of his goals. We know from the research that school connectedness and engagement in school and academics, they can be really powerful protective factors for kids. Even, kids who've been through a lot in their lives like Jonah. And so here we're really missing those important protective factors for him, right? We also know that schools themselves can also be a pipeline in some cases to the juvenile justice system. So here for Jonah, he got into a fight at school. There was a school resource officer, and then the police were also called, and then he was arrested, right? So in that situation, the incident that occurred in school as a fight turned into an arrest and then prosecution in the juvenile justice system. And this is actually can be quite common. And so our module 8 really highlights this intersection between schools and the system, right? So schools can be an incredible buffer. There are resources at school. I know a lot of kids, right, who are able to access some mental health counseling at school, right? It's often limited, but I've had really great engagement with counselors at school that have really kept them out of the system. And then I've seen many kids for whom, like Jonah, school is not a place of where he feels necessarily supported, right? And it actually ends up being that pipeline for him that has him entering the system. And then once kids are in the juvenile justice system, it increases the likelihood that they will come back to that system and also go on to be in the adult system, right? So we want to interrupt that pipeline as much as we can. And we know also that when kids end up in the system, they tend to have a much more difficult time achieving their academic milestones, graduating from high school, getting their GED, or even going on to have a trade, right? Or go to vocational school, right? High school and college are not for every kid, right? But we also want kids to know that we want those opportunities to be open to everyone. And so module 8 will give you a lot more information, just about that role of schools. And then also, I forgot to mention, module 8 does talk a little bit about the role of school resource officers in some settings. So school resource officers has been a really controversial topic, I think, over the last decade or so. And there is some research that shows in some schools, actually school resource officers, depending on what their role is and how they're trained and how they're perceived, that school resource officers can actually be a source of support for youth. And then there's other research that shows that in schools where there are school resource officers, there's actually an increase in arrests and youth going through that school to prison or juvenile justice pipeline. So it's mixed, but we do provide some resources in that module for you so that you can read up on that and learn more. And those are our 8 modules. So it's a lot of information, and I don't have a slide actually on the appendices, so I'll just kind of share with you what those are. So we have our appendices 1 and 2, where we provide you with an extensive number of different videos. So a lot of viewing resources. I think we even have just one appendix that's devoted entirely to viewing resources. We have another appendix that's devoted entirely to other resources like books that you might be interested in to learn more. And then our appendix 3 is all about those screening and brief assessment tools that I mentioned earlier. that we reference in in module 4. So appendix 3 will give you a lot of information about those most commonly used tools so that you know their names, you know the number of questions they have, you have a sense of what their purpose is, because like I said, some of those tools, the purpose is very, very different than some of the tools that we use on the mental health side, non-juvenile justice mental health side. And then in appendix 4, we have is sort of broken up into a couple of sections. The first section gives you a few organizations that do a lot of reform in the juvenile justice system. And so you have information in there about those organizations, what they do, how to contact them, where their websites are, so that you can learn more about that. And then the remainder of that appendix is all the resources and then specific initiatives that are going on, a lot of them reform initiatives that are going on in the system. So you have so many resources in this guide. So hopefully, yes, but always let us know if there are more that you want us to add. So I just wanted to sort of close our intro to the resource with a quote from a clinician working in detention. Acknowledge and search for untapped strengths and potential. No matter how hopeless the situation seems, there is always something that these young people are good at, whether they know it or not, and this can be fostered and developed. So thank you all so, so much for taking this time out of what I'm sure is a very busy day to listen to our introduction. Thank you for your interest in this resource. You are the reason that we created this. And I hope that I hope you find this resource helpful for your practice and the work that you're doing and the amazing work that you're doing with your clients. And just a special thanks to everyone listed here. Dr. Ford in particular, who is a co-author on this resource and over many years, right, has been helpful in modifying and adapting and editing and so many versions. Could not have done this without him. And Dr. Adjoa Abweji, who isn't working with us right now, but has also put in an enormous amount of work and time into making this resource happen. And Riley, who is on right now as well. Thank you for running everything. You have been an essential component of this too. So just a reminder too to check out our future webinars on the resource. So this was intended to be an introduction, a kickoff to our resource and provide you with an overview. But we have a few additional webinars coming up in the future that are going to be very specific to the content. So on September 12th, I'll be talking way more in depth about the juvenile justice system itself. So we'll really focus on those modules 1 and 2, all of that content. And then on October 31st, we'll dive into some more detail on screening and assessment in the system. So really highlighting that module 4 and that appendix 3. And then January 9th, we'll be talking a lot about interventions, those commonly used interventions in the system. So highlighting that module 5. And then in March, we'll talk about kind of wrap up our webinar series on this topic, talking about tips for mental health professionals and strategies for working, trauma-informed strategies for working with youth and families, and also other professionals in the system. And definitely take a moment to scan this QR code. So this is how you access the CTRJJ website, including all of the other resources that are on there. So many incredible resources that have been developed, including a podcast. And this is also where you'll be able to find the link to the guide. So we have an electronic version of the guide and it's broken up into the different modules, right? So if there's a particular topic that you're interested in and you want to just focus on that topic, you can, but you can also download the entire guide itself. So there's both an electronic and a downloadable option. And the guide should be available starting early next week. And I believe that we'll be sending out a blast to the mailing list that hopefully all of you are on to let you know that it's ready and giving you a link to where you can find it. And then lastly, this is the certificate of participation. So please take a moment if you'd like to obtain a certificate to take a photo of this slide with your phone. You can use this hyperlink to download it. And then another thing I just want to note is be on the lookout for a post survey we'll be sending out to you to get your feedback and ask you some questions. So please, if you can participate in that survey, that's always very helpful to us. And I can open it up for questions now if people have questions, or Dr. Ford or Riley, if you have anything else that you want to share about the resource or anything else.
I see a question, Dr. Bates, that I think is a very good one. Um, how will providers address children and youth with special healthcare needs and their communities to safely access inclusive resources, especially given
Oh,
the new federal executive order of ending crime and disorder on America's streets?
yeah, that's such a good question. Yes, and something that we need to incorporate, I think, more. Things are changing so quickly. And so I think being able to access, right, and helping providers be able to access those resources, I think is a topic that we don't go into in detail in this resource, but definitely should address. So I think that's a good one to add to our module for sure. Thank you
And
for raising that.
And Ms. Menendez, who offered that question, also asked whether there's a plain language and other language versions of the guide, especially for providers and communities that have limited English proficiency. And I believe the answer to
Oh,
that is not yet,
not yet.
but that is one of our absolute next steps.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. That's a great suggestion. We are planning to do that. Thank you for those wonderful questions. Any other questions?
And one of the other attendees wanted to know if the certificate will be emailed as they can't get it to download.
Oh no.
Perhaps we could email the certificate along with the link to the guide when we send out the links on Monday.
That sounds great. Yes, we'll be happy to do that. I'm sorry that's not working, but yes, absolutely. We can send that all together. We can
And,
just send a PDF, I think, of the certificate.
and I see a number of thanks, which I want to share. That was just a really wonderful presentation, Dr. Bates. I,
Thank
I
you.
feel like I've been working in the juvenile justice system. I was drafted into it by a colleague. I knew nothing about it. I still am learning, but I feel as though I've learned a great deal more by walking with youth through the experience that Jonah has had. And that was a really wonderful way to introduce the guide, as well as to help those of us who are less familiar with the justice system to pay attention to the kinds of challenges that youth and families are facing. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all. Oh, shout out to the legal aid family. Thanks for joining, everyone.